All right. Good morning, everybody. Hope you had a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. It is June. I was talking to a reporter this morning in Washington, and we were talking about how construction was deemed essential in many ways back in 2020. And I was remembering, and Gary, I mentioned your name as well, exactly a year ago this week we were working with the governor's office on ensuring that on June 8th, 2020, when the world started reopening, that construction was part of phase one of the reopening. So it's hard to believe it's been a year. We've come a long way. We've got some challenges still, but we're really in a good place, I think. We are very excited to hear from our state comptroller, Tom DiNapoli, and to hear about his latest report on the impact of COVID-19 on the construction industry. As we all know, it's been a great impact on the city and state's economy, and the construction industry was no exception to a devastating 14 months that have just passed. We're very excited to be joined, of course, by New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli, who I will say is one of the most wonderful human beings I've ever met. And I don't say that about many people. And of course, our vice chairman of the Building Congress, but more importantly, the president of the Building Trades Council of Greater New York and president of the New York State Building and Construction Trades Council, Gary LaBarbera. We'll hear more from Tom DiNapoli shortly. He's going to go over his report, but we thought we'd just start with just a nice discussion. And Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you to start. It's been an interesting year. Tell us how the state comptroller's office has adapted to a whole new world.
It certainly has been a whole new world. Carlo, thank you for inviting me to participate with you, my dear friend Gary LaBarbera. The two of you are such important champions for the construction industry, the firms, and the men and women who work in the industry. The two of you and the folks you represent really provide an important voice. And certainly the Building Congress, not just you, Carlo, your entire team, we love working with you and your chair, Elizabeth Velez. As we are getting to the new normal, I don't have any doubt that the Congress and the firms that are part of it and the unions that are part of it are going to be a key part of moving us forward. And you're one of my favorite human beings as well, I should say that. You know, I think for our office, we've had to adapt, as I'm sure everyone on the call has done the same. And now we're learning to unwind some of that adapting. But, you know, certainly from the start of, going back to March, April, May of last year, we basically were in closed down mode for, with 2,800 people in our organization, largely based in the capital in Albany, but strong presence in New York City and in regional offices all across the state, with the exception of the Albany office, where a skeleton crew continued to show up for work. And I was there most of the time during the beginning of this year or so of crisis. Our folks have been working remotely, and it really is a credit to the men and women who work in the controls office, most of whom are union employees, I should point out. Civil service, PEF and CSEA represented employees, but we approved the contracts, we paid the bills, we got the pension checks out. Certainly in the beginning of the COVID-19 emergency, we worked closely with the governor's office, expediting payments for personal protective equipment, for ventilators, emergency response. So, things obviously have turned the corner now. We are still largely working remotely. We have not told folks to come back at this point, although I'm starting to spend a little more time in the city office myself. But look, you learned as you went along. There were certainly bumps in the road in the beginning, but I think like so many other businesses and nonprofits and government agencies across the state, we learned the hard way, but we got to a good place, and we have been able to fulfill the mission of the Comptroller's office, I think, remarkably well.
And you've had what, the best pension return year?
Well, I didn't want to mention that because then you'd think I was bragging, Carlo.
No, I want you to brag.
But I'll just say it very quickly. COVID hit mid-March, and we value our fund on March 31st. So you remember the markets went way down right away. So by March 31st of 2020, we actually ended up with a negative return, a modest negative, but still a negative minus 2.68. Well, since then, obviously the markets have come back, and not that we're only invested in the stock market, but that's a big part of our portfolio. We did have a record, over 33% return. As far back as 40 years that we could find the files, we've never had a return that high. So we're, almost $255 billion fund, third largest in the country. So that promise of retirement security to the men and women who are part of our pension system, that is a promise we can continue to fulfill. And we're very, very proud of that. And, part of our success is that we try to invest as much money as we can within our own New York State economy. So, we're very proud of those returns. And once again, we not only are large, but we're among the best funded of all this public pension plans in the country. Something else that we're happy about for New York State's finances, for taxpayers, and certainly for the men and women who are part of the pension system.
Tom, that's amazing. Gary, I know we talked about this a lot over the last 14 months. A lot of new protocols came in place and practices, some that, should survive and maybe some that shouldn't. Give us a sense of what makes sense to stay and what practices you think have maybe served their livelihood already.
Well, good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure for me to be with both you, Carlo, as always, and certainly Tom DiNapoli. It's always a pleasure to be with you, my dear friend. So that's a good question, and in fact, this morning I was actually having a conversation with some other industry stakeholders about what should stay, what should go, and just as a little bit of history, as you recall, when the shutdown first started, there was the opportunity that construction was considered essential. That was all construction. We quickly scrambled as an industry, and I got to say it was very collaborative between all industry stakeholders, as you know, Carlo, to come up with what we thought were important protocols. A few weeks after the mandate that all construction was considered essential, then it was narrowed just to projects that were, for example, airports and like Moynihan Train Hall, transportation centers. Certainly hospital work was quite a bit, and even the pop-up hospitals that were going on throughout the city, really throughout the state. Those critical infrastructure projects were deemed essential and continue to work. So obviously, as an industry, our concern was balancing the importance of keeping as much of the economic engine moving forward and open on these important transportation projects and other critical projects, such as Javits, which, Carlo, you and I, a couple of weeks ago, were with the governor for the ribbon cutting. And, that was considered critical, essential, because, it's going to be hopefully one of the venues that bring New York back, right? Brings more tourism and business to New York City. So we did put, many protocols in place, obviously social distancing where possible, and you had to wear a mask at all times anywhere on the site, and temperature scanning, and I think some just really good hygiene practices. So where we are today is, we probably have about 50% of people that are vaccinated on these sites, and we're encouraging, members to get vaccinated. We're actually working and having conversations perhaps about bringing in, pop-up centers to the sites to incentivize easier access to vaccines. But primarily, some of the restrictions, for example, the amount of personnel in a hoist, at this point in time, I think that's something that could be reviewed and perhaps, done away with. Some of the social distancing issues, I think, given the rate of vaccination and depending upon where you're working, I think, wearing of masks outdoors, it may not be necessary at this point in time, maybe in confined spaces until the rates of vaccinations go up a little further. we were doing quite a bit of sanitizing of tools, shared tools. We've later learned that the virus really doesn't necessarily transmit on tools, metals, the way originally thought. So that may be something that could come out of the guidance. But whatever stays should really be based on good health practices and hygiene practices. Not only to address the issue of what happened during the pandemic, but in general, we have every year we have a flu season, we have colds and viruses, and I think good hygienics and clean sites is something that have really grown out of this, and that should become a priority in the industry and should remain. So I think a number of issues can be addressed as this progresses, but I think to answer your question specifically, I think hygiene issues, health and hygiene issues, that those should remain, and that would include actually hand wash stations and hand sanitizer. On many sites there was no real hot or cold water hand wash stations prior to the pandemic. During the pandemic, that was part of the guidance. And so I think things like that are just good hygiene practices and health practices. So I think some will remain, but many will be done away with, to be candid with you, and as a step getting back to normal.
Yeah, agreed, and it all makes sense. By the way, Gary mentions Javits. You may see I have a 100-year logo on my screen. We're celebrating 100 years this year, Tom. So our 100th anniversary celebration will be at the new Javits on November 18th. So mark your calendars. Yes, Tom, let's talk a little bit about the budget, city budget, a lot of issues, and state budget's been enacted. Give us your sense on both budgets, where we are, and maybe where you think the federal money should play a role in our budgets.
Yeah. By the way, our pension fund is celebrating its 100th year this year as well. So we don't have a Javits Center gala planned for it, but
we'll wish you a happy birthday at ours.
It's nice that we were born in the same year. It's interesting. There are parallels with the city and the state budget, and there obviously are some differences as well. But suffice it to say, when the pandemic first hit and the economy basically being closed down, revenues, because of economic activity being on hold, revenues tanked. Particularly when you look at sales tax revenue, we were charting that on a monthly basis. The period April to June was down like 27%. And that's a big revenue source for the state, for local governments, for New York City as well. In the beginning, personal income tax as well. Those collections were down. And you had a couple of dynamics at play. The economy started coming back, frankly, a little stronger than folks had first anticipated. And really the big game changer for both the city and the state has been the federal relief. Going back to last year with the Coronavirus Relief Fund, reimbursement for COVID-related expenses. Then in December, you had an additional federal package, not only money for government, but for small businesses and healthcare and so on. And then obviously with the new administration and the new Congress, the American Rescue Plan. So what had been a time of dire predictions for the city and the state budget, certainly those prospects change. So, when you look at the city budget, despite challenges and the city's economy, because of being the epicenter of the COVID pandemic, was harder hit than the rest of the state's economy. And so that meant the city's revenue were very, very hard hit. But that additional federal money and higher than expected revenues has made it a better picture in the short run. You're still talking about out-year budget gaps that grow to like $4 billion on an annual basis a couple of years down the road. So that's a concern. For the city, what will be the impact in terms of real estate valuations? What will a lot of folks, I'm sure, owners are, going going to be filing certiorari, challenging assessments, as a consequence of COVID, and some of that will take time to work out. The city did reduce their expectation of property tax revenue, very big revenue source for the city. State doesn't have a property tax. So that's one issue. Commuters returning to office buildings and spending money while they're in the city. Obviously, we got a ways to go on that. The tourism industry. So there are still some problematic areas with the city's recovery. Keep in mind for the city as well, you have most of the collective bargaining agreements expiring. So what will be the new agreements? What will be the impact on the city budget? So short term, federal relief has made a huge difference. So while that money's coming in, that will provide balance and relief. Long term, the new mayoral administration is going to have to contend, I'm sure, with some tough questions. Similar for the state. Obviously the money that came into the state, 12.7 billion directly to the state, billions more for New York City, for localities, for hospitals and so on, healthcare facilities. But that 12.7 billion directly for the state budget has made an incredible difference. So the state budget was the largest one enacted. And again, like the city, revenues came in more strongly than anticipated. We had been charting for several months that Division of Budget was underestimating the personal income tax revenue. And then, of course, at the state level, you did see a decision made by the legislature and the governor to increase certain tax revenue, higher tax on upper income New Yorkers, and increase the corporate franchise tax for certain categories. More revenue is expected to come in with mobile sports betting, adult use cannabis. So, combination of recovery of the economy, federal money coming in, and increased revenues, you've got a record spending level at the state. Important investments, particularly in education and healthcare. I don't think anybody disputes that. The challenge for the state, like for the city, is as the federal money will be spent down, the expectation is that the economic recovery will be such that that will replace the federal money. But we do face the potential for there to be a real cliff. And one of the concerns, a couple of concerns that we have with the state budget, I'll wrap up on this, is that with all of this money coming in now, missed opportunities. We did not build up our rainy day reserve funds. New York historically has underfunded the reserves for those tough days compared to other states. Certain expenses were pushed to future years, another $3.5 billion in Medicaid expenses pushed to the future, and authorization for short-term borrowing, which frankly at this point I don't think we need. So, for both city and the state, what will it look like when the federal money is being spent down? Will in fact the expectations for a strong economy and strong recovery, will it hold up? If it doesn't, we're going to have to make some tough choices about where we're headed, particularly on the spending side. But for now, we're doing a whole lot better. And the big game changer, again, is the federal help. We can't underestimate that. Thank you to the Biden-Harris administration, and certainly having Chuck Schumer as Senate Majority Leader has made a big difference for us in New York.
Agreed. He's from Brooklyn, Tom. I just want to throw that.
Oh, Brooklyn! I've heard of Brooklyn. Yes, yeah.
I've heard of it.
And my family's from East New York. Remember that?
No, we know. Okay. But this is Tom, and appreciate the candor on the budget, because I think you're bringing up critical points that all of us, not just in our industry, but in every industry, have to be ready for a year from now. And that discussion has to happen. But where do you see our industry in a year from now? And that's really for Tom and Gary, for both of you. I feel good, for example. I think a year from now, we're going to be in a good spot, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, if Tom, if you don't mind, I'll just share my thoughts, and then you can jump in. So, Carlo, I tend to agree with you. I mean, look, and I think probably most of the participants on this call are very aware of the fact that what happened during the shutdown. I mean, there were projects, everything stopped, and there was not a lot in design. And so we see that, and this is reflected in Tom's report, which I know he'll speak to, in projections in terms of building permits. I think we're right now carrying through on work that was ongoing initially. And I think we will continue to do that through the end of this year. I could see, just because of the delays, that in early 2022, there could be a bit of a dip. But I do believe by third quarter of next year, with what I'm hearing from the industry and owners, both on the private side and on the public side, talking about projects that they're anticipating getting started, which includes a lot of work out at JFK. I mean, I'm talking about $10 billion worth of work out there. I think that is, there's a likelihood that that's all going to come together. It's on its way coming together. There's some major projects here in Midtown. Steve Roth and Renato are looking to build 3 towers. The Grand Hyatt, that's the TF Cornerstone RXR project. It's a massive 2.3 million square foot project. They're going to demo the entire current hotel there, which used to be the Commodore, if you remember, and then it became the Grand Hyatt. And just on and on. That's not to mention, which I think Tom can also speak to, the anticipation and certainly the strong likelihood of a meaningful infrastructure bill. So I also think, that, we know that the borough-based jails, that's $8.7 billion worth of work that will be done design build. That's going to happen. And then money is set aside for that with the city. And so between, I think, where we are now and with an infrastructure a bill that comes forward, I tend to agree with you. In a year from now, I think we'll be back in a position that will have strong employment, strong growth. And I think the next couple of years will be good following. I just think we have to get through the next year. But that's just my assessment from speaking to individuals, from the development side of both the public and private sector. And so, Tom, I don't know if you want to share your thoughts on that as well in terms of the Biden infrastructure and the impacts that would have on the state's economy as well.
Yeah, a couple of quick thoughts. I won't jump the gun on our report because we touch on some of this in the report, but very much want to echo, what you're expressing, Gary. So similar to what, I said about the city and state budget, when you look at the question of infrastructure and the construction industry, so much of what has kept it going, even over 2020, has been government spending. So whether that's the state, the city, the MTA, Port Authority, mention that as well. All of that has been key, and that's really where the federal dollars, thus far have made a huge difference. But to the point that you made, Gary, and I know Carlo certainly echoes this. The pending proposal for there to be a major infrastructure initiative coming out of Washington would really be a home run for us in New York. Because even if you just look at the MTA and all the capital spending there, they're able to get some of it back on track. But I mean, the MTA, as we all know, has been so hard hit, and there's so much about their finances that are still challenged and problematic. And until you get folks back on the subways and the rail lines, and that revenue picks up, the capital plan, as we've seen in the past, is often the first thing that gets shortchanged. So some of those projects are back on track. Pardon to use that phrase, talking about the MTA, but there are still gaps. There's gaps in what the city is going to contribute to the capital plan. The state has stepped up to do some bonding for their share, but we know from prior years that first of all, the MTA is often challenged to get its projects out the door to begin with, and when they have shortfalls, they'll trim back on their capital plan. So if we can get that infusion of infrastructure money from Washington, certainly starting with the MTA, you will be able to see the kind of spending that will really be a continued boost for resurgence and resilience in the construction industry. And the same is certainly true for the capital projects at the state level and the city level as well. Keep in mind, when we've seen other downturns, you look at past history, it's usually taken the construction industry, close to 5 years to get back to where it was before. Hopefully won't take quite that long, with this recovery. But I think that, to Gary's point, that the expenditures on the government side is really key to all of this. And obviously the overall recovery of the New York City economy, the return of tourism, we have a lot of hotel construction in the pipeline. We don't have a lot of tourists right now. So we need that to bounce back as well in terms of the numbers, so that the folks that are putting their money in building hotels, in fact, are going to see the return. So there's still, challenges out there, both in terms of private investment, but the experience has always been when the government puts some money in, private investment follows as well.
Agreed. Tom, before we talk about your new report, I just want to get a sense from you. I know you did a report a while ago on the PPP, the Paycheck Protection. Give us a sense of what you thought of that and maybe just some of your key findings.
Well, I mean, there were obviously a lot of bumps in the beginning, with the initial rollout of the program. In the later iterations, they improved, in terms of some of the guidelines, made it easier. When you look at the numbers we looked at with the different phases of the PPP program, New York City businesses, a little over 45% were able to access those loans. That's a little lower than the national average, which was about 51% of businesses were able to access that. Our numbers showed about 8.7% of those loan dollars went to firms in the construction industry. So, I think they got it better as it went along. But obviously, there were many challenges with some of the requirements in the program, again, because they made it a little easier. Look, it was a lifeline for many businesses. There's no doubt about it. But it underscores the importance of government support for the private sector through, an emergency situation. So hopefully, as things, start to get back to normal, those that benefited from that program, that will prove to be a lifeline that got them back to the new normal. But no doubt there were certainly bumps, particularly in the beginning of the rollout of that program.
Sounds good. Gary, before we turn to Tom to talk about the report, just want to, I know you've been very proud of the work you guys have done on diversity and equity and inclusion and how we're keeping New York a union town. Give us a sense of where we are with that. And then Tom, we'll hear from you on your report.
Oh, Gary, you're muted.
Well, there you are.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate
You're welcome.
that. Good catch. So, Carlo, thank you for raising that. I appreciate that very much. And the issue of diversity is very important to the Building Trades Council and has been for many, many years now. And we've seen the results in terms of data and in terms of, if you walk onto a site today, you'll see the diverse makeup of the workforce. And we are almost 55% of all membership minority, and that number just continues to grow. Our apprentices are 68% minority coming into the trade. So obviously, eventually, those apprentices will become journeymen, and as more members retire through attrition, you're only going to see this 55 go to 60% to 65%, and I think be even higher than 68% at some point. So that's really an important component that the industry, the workforce, represents the demographics of the city. And we have, just quickly, I don't want to take up too much time, but we have 4 pre-apprentice programs that we are affiliated with, which is construction skills, which focuses primarily on high school students from technical high schools, P2A, which is Pathways to Apprentice, which is really focused solely on formally justice-involved individuals. We have non-traditional employment for women, which is everyone's familiar with as well, and then our Helmets to Hard Hats, our veterans program. And so we use these pre-apprentice direct entry programs to help advance diversity and opportunity. And I just say this quickly. One of the things I think was very significant that we did with the city last year, we did an announcement actually last August, is we negotiated a project labor agreement with the city. It was really, when you take all of the capital work together, it's about $40 billion worth of work, that including the $8.7 billion for the jails that I mentioned, borough-based jails. But what we did that was really historic is we really focused on underserved communities, and we have a special focus on communities by using zip codes where 15% or more of the residents in that community are below the federal poverty line. And unfortunately, that number is between 50 and 60% of communities. So it's a little bit more than half of the communities fall into that category. And those, obviously those are underserved communities, and we want to bring opportunity to those communities and to the people in those communities. So we're very proud of the work. I think we've, done something very significant with the city in terms of, this kind of local hire and opportunity approach. And, we're proud of the work we're doing, and we're going to continue to do this work to create opportunity. I'll just close by saying, the unionized construction industry is a real opportunity to a career in this industry. And it is a great alternative for those that, don't think they want to go to college or don't think they're college material. This is an industry where you can go through an apprentice program, you can learn a skilled trade, and you can really wind up with a great career and a middle class, family sustaining job that with benefits and retirement, and really get you a piece of the American dream. So we're proud of the work we're doing, and Carl, thank you for raising that, because it's something that we're very committed to.
It is, it is true, Gary, what you say. It's an industry that if young people knew from when they were young, from when they were in school, that there were so many opportunities. Wow, what a great career they could have, and what a great life they could have. So we echo what you said, and thank you. So Tom, you and your office put together a report on something we love, which is the construction industry. And I'm going to turn it over to you, because I think it's phenomenal what you've done, and it raises a lot of questions and a couple of concerns, to be honest, but that's what we're supposed to do. So Tom DiNapoli, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carlo, very much. We issue these reports periodically on many sectors of the city's economy. It really is a way to inform a more intelligent discussion in the public arena among all stakeholders about where we're at, and more importantly, where we need to go. So I certainly hope that this latest report, Construction Industry in New York City, Recent Trends and Impact of COVID-19, I think it's timely. I think it's important. It's available on our website, and I know, Carlo, you'll help to get it out. And I do want to say to you, Carlo, and to Gary as well, thank you for working with our team here at the Controller's Office and helping us frame the issues that were addressed in this report. We have a great team headed by our Deputy Controller, Rahul Jain, and his lead analyst on this report, Wei-Zi Wang, spent a lot of time on pulling this together. And I'll just mention some of the highlights. We'll see if there are any questions. I do want to, though, echo what you and Gary were just talking about. We always look at, jobs, right? That's so important for all of us. But I think to the point that was made in the earlier discussion, when you're talking about the apprenticeship programs that unions work out and collaborate with industry, you're not just talking about jobs, you're talking about a career, and Gary really spoke to it so eloquently. And I do think in terms of the diversity, equity, inclusion issue, which is so timely for all of us right now, the trades, the unions do not get enough credit for how effectively they've been responding to that call, not just in the wake of George Floyd's murder, but that is something that has been building over a number of years. So I'm glad, Carlo, that you and Gary discussed that important point. So what did we find? Well, first of all, you remember it wasn't that long ago, Carlo and Gary, we were together in 2019, and we had our wonderful report on the construction industry in New York City, and we could brag about how the industry was booming, record employment levels for 4 straight years, a growth of over 46,000 jobs from 2010 to 2018, pegging construction as the city's fastest growing employment sector from the years 2011 to 2019, over a 43% growth rate compared to a 24% growth rate for the rest of the private sector. Well, fast forward to spring of 2020, COVID changed everything. And obviously construction was not left out of the impact, both in New York City, New York State, and obviously across the United States of America. But the reality, again, because of New York City being the epicenter early of the pandemic, New York City was particularly hard hit. In 2020, New York State had the highest construction job loss of any state, nearly 20% of industry job losses nationwide. In 2020, we lost over 44,000 construction jobs. It was the worst annual decline, I'm talking state numbers now, in 25 years. Again, because of how COVID hit New York City, and with construction being really put on hold at the start of the second quarter of 2020, the industry took, as you all know better than me, an incredible hit, a loss of over 23,000 construction jobs. More than half of the jobs lost in the entire state in construction happened in the 5 boroughs of New York City. The employment in construction for the city was down over 14%. Compare that to the overall loss in the private sector of 12.7%. So construction fared worse than the rest of the private sector economy. Queens lost about 6,900 construction jobs, Manhattan 6,800, Brooklyn 5,600, Bronx 1,600, Staten Island 1,200. So every borough was affected. That being said, when we look at all these numbers, it certainly still underscores for the city's economy to have resilience and strength, we need the construction industry to have resilience and strength as well for the city, for the state. New York State, even looking at the 2020 numbers with all the challenges, our state had the 4th largest construction sector in the entire country. Construction employment in the greater New York City metro area, so not just the boroughs, but including Long Island, Lower Hudson Valley, Northern New Jersey, the highest in the nation in terms of employment, 373,800 jobs. The number of construction firms in New York City, actually, with all the challenges of 2020, Carlo, I think you know this, the number of construction firms actually went up. They're smaller firms, but still up by 23 we counted. So that's a bit of a positive sign. New York City construction firms generated $85 billion in economic activity, about 8% of the city's total economic output. And the sector was responsible for close to $12 billion in wages. Construction was the 4th highest paying employment sector in the city, with an average salary of a little over $87,000. Immigrants held 53% of the construction jobs in New York City. Compare that to the rest of the state, immigrants account for 18% of those jobs, 24% when you look at the national averages. The average salary in the construction industry has increased over the decade prior to 2020, up about 20%. And to a point that that was made a little earlier, New York City has had a higher share, not just on the employment side, but a higher share of minority-owned construction firms, 25%, higher than the rest of the state, where 21% of firms are minority-owned, higher than the nation, where the number is at 19%. I should also mention, although the differences aren't as wide, in New York City, the construction industry, when you look at the firms, a higher percentage of women-owned firms as well, and I think that's worth noting. When we look at New York City construction spending in 2020, $55.5 billion in the year 2020. That represents a decrease of about $5 billion, less than the year 2019, down about 8.5%. Was the first decline after an average increase of over 12% a year for the previous 8 years. Government spending on construction, again, following up on what we talked about a little earlier, was the only category of construction spending that grew in 2020. It actually increased 6.7% to $21 billion, underscores the importance of government to this sector. We already talked about the federal relief packages thus far and the pending $1.7 trillion plan with the American Jobs Plan. I'll just state the obvious again. It is critical that there be agreement in Washington on the American Jobs Plan, that it have a significant contribution for spending on infrastructure, certainly including our public transit system, because that gets very much to the MTA question that we talked about earlier. You know, those discussions are continuing. It'd be great if they could come up with a bipartisan plan. That's been elusive for a long time. But either way, I'm very pleased that President Biden has made it a clear priority that he is going to deliver on an infrastructure plan. That's going to continue to be a game changer for all of us. As I said earlier, though, even with additional help from Washington, you know, you're really talking about a period of years before we see recovery back to where it once was for the construction industry in the city and for the state. As I said, you look at the previous downturns, usually about 5 years. Hopefully this one won't take quite that long, but federal relief, pent-up demand, the potential for new infrastructure projects, all of this should hopefully boost activity in the New York City construction industry. And again, we have to work collaboratively. We have to share thoughts between government, industry, labor, because we have to focus on building. I mean, we're an older community, we're a thriving community. I am not a pessimist on New York City's future. The resilience of New York City has been proven time and again, but a key part of the resilience of New York City has been the construction industry. So, you know, working together, you know, with Gary and his colleagues in labor, and certainly all the firms represented in the New York Building Congress, and really the role of the Congress, Carlo, we'll put it back on you as a convener of all the stakeholders tied to the New York City construction industry and helping to provide a unified voice as to what government needs to do to respond to the interests of the industry and labor. We need the Congress to be as strong as ever in being that unified voice for the industry. So I'm hoping this report will be helpful in terms of charting where we're at after a very difficult year, and certainly suggesting, particularly with regard to government, the role that has to be played if we're going to have the kind of rebuilding and resurgence in the construction industry, which, as we know from our prior reports, is so fundamental to the underpinning of the economic strength of New York City. And as goes New York City, so goes New York State. So it's in all of our interest to support all of you on this call that are involved in the construction industry. And again, I hope this report will be helpful in having all of us be more engaged in a thoughtful conversation about how we get the construction industry back on track.
Tom, that was amazing. I mean, really very well thought out, very focused. I would add one last thing, though, to what you said. As goes New York City, goes New York State, and really goes the nation.
Yes.
You know, we represent over 20% of the nation's GDP just in the New York region. It's why, you know, the Gateway Project, for example, is so critical. But really an amazing report. I want to start with something that we touched on earlier and is in the report about the 5 years. You know, it generally would take 5 years to get the construction industry back. Do you think, and I would suggest that this downturn is a little different because it was, you know, yes, it was economic, but it was caused because of a health crisis. And by the way, also a social justice crisis. We don't want to, you know, lay low on that one. But the fact that government is so focused on infrastructure and building right now, do you have a sense that that can make the 5 years shorter in the long run?
Yes, the short answer is yes, and frankly, it has to. If there's one thing we learned through this challenging time, it's certainly the importance of government, right? And you know, we could certainly point to some missteps in the beginning because I don't think anybody on this call was around for the, you know, for the flu of 100 years ago. None of us had anticipated. This really came out of the blue, and think how quickly everything shut down and what the impact was, because, you know, we had to do the, you know, the masks, and as Gary was talking earlier, you know, all the hygienic steps, and then getting the vaccine developed and getting folks to take the vaccine. It's been a long haul. Underscores the importance of government. And then you look in terms of the dire projections on where our city finances and our state finances were going to be going back, you know, 5-6 months ago. It's been the federal government and the federal relief that has really saved state and local governments. And then you look at the support, not just for the healthcare sector, but for so many other industries and certainly small businesses, again, coming out of government. Without government, I don't know where we would be right now. So, when you talk about the question of infrastructure, and we've all talked about this before on other occasions. I don't know how many years we've been talking about, infrastructure is the one area where there can be bipartisan agreement. How many times we heard that during the Trump administration for a bit during Obama, and they never got together, despite everybody saying we could all agree on infrastructure. It never happened. Well, I really do think maybe it'll be one of the good things to come out of this time of great division and partisanship. I think there's a collective understanding that for every state, not just for New York, we need to continue to keep this economy moving. And there's no better way to do that than spending money on infrastructure. So if we get an ambitious infrastructure program out of Washington, you have in New York City and New York State so much already on the books in terms of projects that are in the pipeline, either already planned for or certainly on the drawing boards. Yes, Carlo, I think absolutely if we get the money to back it up, that can speed up that time frame. It'll go quicker than the 5-year cycle that I mentioned. And the other piece of it is, we do need the city to continue to reopen. We need people to be back on the trains and the subways. I had dinner in the city last night out there, and I have to say the city is starting to come back to life again. Even downtown, where my office is, there are more people. The elevator actually stopped on a floor when I was coming up. That hasn't happened too much lately. We need people coming back into the office buildings. We need those in the private sector that still want to build whatever the building is, particularly the hotels that are in the pipeline. We want them to continue to be committed to that. So, that's where the whole ecosystem for construction, it needs the catalyst of the government money to come in. That will help bring everything back, including the confidence in the private sector and private financing that we're going to need as well. So my biggest fear is that there be a deadlock, a gridlock, and Biden is not successful. I think he will be, but if we don't get that additional boost of that construction and infrastructure money from Washington, maybe that 5 years will be even longer. So to the extent that all of you on this call have some input to our federal delegation, and they're terrific in New York, our senators, and certainly led by Chuck and our members of Congress, we've got to keep supporting their efforts to deliver on an aggressive infrastructure package in Washington. That'll make a huge difference for New York City and for New York State.
And I think the good news is I just read earlier that the president is meeting with the Republicans again today or tomorrow. I think they continue the gap gets narrower. So we will have an infrastructure plan. And I think it's a generational infrastructure package. We may not see another one for 20 years. I mean, I think you mentioned Obama tried, Trump tried, Bush did some, but when was the last time we really had a focused infrastructure plan for America? This may be the moment. So it's an exciting time. Tom, when you think about job growth trends, pre-pandemic, the construction industry was really the fastest growing employment sector in the city. Now, based on the data, do you think construction follows other trends in terms of job growth, or does the private sector follow the construction industry?
Interesting.
Interesting
way to put it. Yeah.
We always make the case that construction spending has a multiplier.
Yes.
Yes. I had relatives in from Chicago this weekend, and we took a walk to Hudson Yards and did the High Line and everything. And we were there at about lunchtime. And there had to be, 100, 200 construction workers in Hudson Yards at lunchtime that were either online for lunch at one of the small places or eating outside their lunch that they bought from one of the small places. So I just feel like our industry has such a broad impact and a big spectrum of focus.
Yeah. No, I would agree with you. I do think that it is, we in the past, I think we undervalue the importance of that multiplier effect that you talked about. I think it is key. I mean, certainly, look, for now, the industry is lagging, other private sector parts of the economy. My hope is that that's just a temporary, situation. And again, I mean, not to be a broken record, it gets back to the federal money, the state and the city. Look, in their budgets now, because of, again, the increased revenue across the board, not just the federal money, but the revenue being better at the state level, the tax increases, which folks can debate about whether that should or should not have happened, and we'll see what the long-term impact will be. But short term, it means more money coming in. It means some of the capital plans that maybe in other years would have been delayed or put aside, that in fact there can be robust spending, and the city and the state are projecting increased spending in those areas. So yeah, I think that multiplier effect is something we'll have to look at, Carlo, in our next report. But there's a little bit of a lag right now compared to some other industry sectors in the city, but the potential for construction to leapfrog, lead the way again, have that multiplier effect absolutely is there.
Tom, do you worry about the spending on capital and infrastructure at all? Look, our job is to continue to advocate for more spending. It's, in my opinion, it's never enough. And every time we ask for something and you give it to us, we want more. So that's just what we believe on infrastructure and really capital spending. But are we worried at all that how are we going to find the money for it, and is it sustainable in the long term?
Well, let me say this with my controller hat. Where we've tried very much to take the long-term view of things. I'll put capital spending aside just for a moment. I think spending overall, when you look at the state level, there were choices being made, particularly with regard to education, healthcare, to take advantage of this generational opportunity, as I think you put it earlier, largely because of the federal money, and because of so many folks hurt so hard, particularly in certain communities by the pandemic, to fulfill certain commitments, again, especially in education and healthcare, that hadn't been fully addressed for many years. And part of how that was met, was increasing tax revenue. So on the pure spending side, the question is, and I don't have an answer. I think everybody has an opinion. Nobody really has the answer. It's going to take time to look. Will some of those choices on revenue raisers, tax increases, have a negative unintended consequence? We hear this all the time, right? I talked to so-and-so, they're well off. They've been living in Florida during the pandemic. They don't want to pay the taxes anymore. The tax burden is too high, especially when you accumulate, state and city taxes, and more taxes may come out of Washington, and we have to acknowledge that the top 1%, at least looking at the state numbers, pay about 40% of the personal income tax revenue. So at some point, do we lose some of those higher income people and not have the revenue coming in as anticipated? We don't know the answer to that yet. We have to keep a close look at that. So to the extent that our money in the budget is funding the capital programs as well, my concern there, which we've expressed for many years, having nothing to do with the pandemic and what we've just been going through, is that I don't think, at least speaking for the state, we've always done we clearly haven't always done as good a job in terms of having the money for the MTA capital plan, which is such an important part of the spending we're talking about. But I also feel we haven't always done such a good job of prioritizing what our infrastructure and capital needs are. And you saw that particularly, when after the Great Recession hit and you had the money coming with stimulus money during the Obama years, where right there, the talk was shovel ready. What are your shovel ready projects? Well, some of that money went to projects, frankly, that didn't have that much of a benefit or payback, but those were the ones that somebody had the plans ready to go. And so I think not only inventorying what our needs are, but prioritizing them more carefully, and then recognizing that even on the capital side, even with borrowing the costs being at historic low levels, we still have to recognize that New York State is one of the most highly indebted states in the nation. We haven't, some of our capital money in the past we've used for non-capital purposes. We're still paying for some of those bad choices of the past. So we need not to repeat bad choices. We need to do a better job of prioritizing, because at the end of the day, there's not an unlimited amount of money. But the backstop that hopefully we'll get out of Washington, will be the big game changer in this whole discussion. But yeah, I would have a concern about it, and you could be sure that when we do our next debt report for the state, we will be talking about those kind of concerns, Carlo.
Well, thank you, Tom. Well, I have to say, I think this has been phenomenal. A lot of work to do. I mean, it's, it's not all roses and sunshine, but I think the clouds are breaking. I really believe that. And I think collectively, we will really make sure that we put people back to work. So with that, Tom DiNapoli, State Comptroller, thank you. Gary LaBarbera, Building Trades, thank you. We've got a lot of exciting things ahead for New York, and I'm with you, Tom. My vision is New York hasn't even seen its great days yet. I think we are just about to begin. People are coming back, and even the people that decamped for Florida will want to be back here soon.
Yep. And the building Congress is going to be the glue to keep us all together to stay focused on this industry.
Absolutely.
And Carlo, you owe Gary and I an espresso. We were expecting it to be
I
DoorDash.
do.
We thought it'd be DoorDash delivered today. You didn't come through.
We'll do better next time. But
Okay.
What I will do is I will invite you and Gary to lunch in Brooklyn with an espresso afterwards, and we can support some great local small businesses.
Sounds good. That sounds great.
We will make that happen. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you, Carlo. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Carlo. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.